Hi, and welcome to Nesta Talks 2, our event series where we get to talk to the most interesting thinkers who are talking about the big challenges facing us. Apologies for the late start, we had a slight technical issue, but we are delighted to be able to have John Yates with us, who I'll introduce in a second. Please do put your comments in the panel, and we'll try and bring those in towards the end of the conversation. We had hoped to have live captions streaming. Unfortunately, we've had some difficulties getting that up and running. If that changes, I'll let you know. As I said, John Yates is joining us today. John is the Executive Director of the Youth Endowment Fund. He's a former government advisor and a co-founder of charities, particularly with young people. And he's written an excellent book that we're going to be discussing today called Fractured. And this is about why our societies are coming apart and how we put them back together again. So, John, a really big welcome to you.
A real pleasure to be with you, Ravi. Thank you very much for having me.
So apparently, my colleague said to me that you're actually a stand-up comedian.
An recovering stand-up comedian. I failed fast, as all ventures should, unless they're going to be a massive success. The worst thing was I was consistently mediocre, so I don't even have funny stories of how I was so awful.
I was going to say, if it gets a bit sort of dry, then perhaps people ask the jokes in the comments. Do you think that are comedy events good ways of creating the common life that you talk about in your book? Do they bring people together?
Yeah, I think they can do. I mean, one of the things that I touch on in the book is that we all have actually a natural inbuilt ability to form connection with people if we are thrown together with them, and laughter is one of those sort of weird things hard-boiled into us. Anyone who's ever tried to make people laugh will know that it's much easier to make a crowd of people laugh than a person individually. That's why we laugh when we go to a stand-up show, but we don't when we're at home watching the same thing live. And at the core of that is because laughter isn't actually a sort of reaction to something funny. It's a social experience. So no, laughter is quite a good way of forming connection. Okay,
so compulsory laughter and compulsory comedy coming your way. Now, your argument in the book is that we are more divided as a society than ever before. And I think that's kind of a common narrative. This is an issue that I think many of us are worried about. Sometimes I do wonder about whether we've exaggerated things because we spend too much time on Twitter looking at culture wars, and actually in real life, is it all that bad? So is it really true that we are deeply fractured?
So I think the culture wars can be a bit of a distraction. I think they can be a sort of constant aimless banging going on. I once hired an RV, a very big sort of 10-meter vehicle, and drove it around America, which was great fun until the very end when I was driving through rural Pennsylvania and had a very loud banging noise happening, and I decided to deal with it by turning the radio up. Until eventually someone overtook me and said, your exhaust pipe is almost completely detached. And sometimes the banging isn't the problem, it's the underlying cause of the banging that's the issue. And the culture war, I think, is a distraction. The reason it has some leverage is because it's playing into the divisions in our society that make it credible that there are some other people out there who we don't fully trust. I think the best way to see this, Ravi, is actually to look at our own friendship groups. So half of graduates, half of those of us with degrees, have no friends without a degree. The vast majority of pensioners don't know a single person under the age of 35 apart from their grandchildren. Half of us don't have a single friend from a different ethnic group. A fifth of people who voted to leave and a quarter of those who voted to remain don't have a friend who voted the other way. And yet the biggest divide of all remains wealth. So a UK barrister would have to invite 100 people into their garden, 3 times the legal limit, before they invited a single person who was unemployed. So I think the divisions are very real, very real indeed.
And do you define division as sort of who our social circle is and who we mix with, or would you define it also in terms of trust? Because on the latter front, I think some of the Ipsos Mori data suggests that levels of trust in strangers or neighbours has remained relatively constant, despite the kind of catastrophizing about the decline of trust.
Yeah, I do define it by the level of connection in our social groups. But I think trust is really important. I mean, I talk about the role that trust can play in driving the economy. For example, a 10% increase in trust levels is worth roughly a 0.5% of GDP. I mean, it does matter, and it matters to wider than just money in our pocket. But I think the sort of stability of those trust scores are slightly misleading, because they have fallen quite significantly if one takes the longer view. They have fallen quite significantly from where they were about 75 years ago. And I think that's broadly the timeline we should be. I think there is a slight tendency to think we're having a crisis right now. I think it's more that we're seeing some of the consequences of the disconnection in our social groups and the failure for us to mix that started probably about 50, 60, 70 years ago. And that's where I would trace a lot of this back to.
And a lot of your argument actually takes that very long view and talks about how, due to changes in patterns of work and where we live, particularly to do with the economy, it means that we are living quite separate lives. Would you say, therefore, that story is true across most OECD countries in a consistent way, or is there quite a lot of variation?
So I think the core story is true of the West. I mean, I wouldn't want to stretch it much further than beyond that, partly because it's quite hard to get the data. So the core story is really that, firstly, the average Brit and also the majority of Americans will say that their country is seriously divided. And I think they're onto something. I don't think we should ignore them. I think they're onto something. And we see that, as I say, in our friendship groups. But they also say a further thing, which is when you get into, well, why? Why have we become divided across these countries? Generally, conversations I have with people will pretty quickly come to someone saying, yeah, but, come on, it was always this way. Birds of a feather flock together. And the core first argument of the book is, yeah, that's actually a totally fair comment. And I think often the sort of average person has a better sense of this than a lot of the commentators. So there's been 39,000 academic studies that have basically come to that conclusion, that we have a small, constant bias to people who remind us of ourselves. So in a way, the question shouldn't be, why are we dividing? The question should be, why aren't we more divided? And the reason is that we've always had institutions that actually tend to knit us together, that mix us with people who we didn't choose to spend time with. This bias I talk about, I call it people like me syndrome. We biased with people like me. But there's always been some institutions, which I then call the common life. There's been some common life institutions that have wrestled back against that people like me syndrome. And the reason across the West that we're seeing division, with some small exceptions, is that the common life that used to knit us together has been declining.
And who are the outliers? Is there anyone bucking the trend?
Yeah, there are. So there's two sets of outliers. The first ones are the Nordics, so Scandinavian countries and Finland. When you rank the 100 richest countries in the world for how much people trust each other, how much trust again, how much people connect with each other, how much people take responsibility for each other, those four countries come first, second, third, and fifth. And what's interesting about them is that they're one of the main institutions that knitted together the industrial society was the clubs and societies. They sort of born out of nowhere. They didn't exist in agrarian societies. Sudden huge expansion of them. Nearly all of the ones we know of now, the Guides, the Scouts, the Women's Institute, I can keep going, all date from roughly after the Industrial Revolution. They've withered away here, and in most of the West, they've been pretty steady in the Nordic countries. And the way that they've done that is that they've actually slowed down the rate of change in their societies. I'm not saying they've done it on purpose, but the interesting thing about these sort of voluntary coming togethers is the reason they managed to pull so many. Why were we all joining clubs and societies? Well, they just fitted the moment. They really absolutely fitted what society was looking for at that time. But when society changes, they don't fit the moment quite so well. And they don't adapt fast. Voluntary coming together do not adapt quickly to change. And the Nordics, by protecting, using welfare to protect change and the impact of change in their economy, by reducing the movement of people within and into and out of their countries, and also by not having the impact of competition on people's time. The TV is much more of a divider than social media. It's one of my main arguments. They've actually maintained those clubs and those associations by slowing down the rate of change. There is another approach, but that's the main one that Western countries have taken. The Nordics have taken.
So the villains of the piece there are quite big long-term changes in terms of our institutions that don't bring us together, like schools and workplaces, national service, etc. The more recent changes we've seen in the last 10, 20 years, such as big changes in immigration, social media, politicians mobilizing on these sort of issues, you think are less substantial?
Well, let me just step back a little bit. I mean, I think it's worth, as you said, I try to take the long view. So just to take the sort of long view here, if we just go right back to when we spent 98% of our time on this planet as a species as hunter-gatherers, and you can find a hunter-gatherer tribe in northern Tanzania near Lake Eyasi called the Hadza, who have been there for 60,000 years. And once a month they come together and they dance in something called the apem. Now, it serves no purpose in their society. It's not about the economy. It doesn't work out who's in charge. It doesn't resolve disputes. But what anthropologists found is the Hadza, who are divided into a set of different families, trust two types of Hadza most. One is other members of their family, and the other is people they dance the apem with. The apem is the sort of knitting institution for the Hadza. And you see in nomadic societies these normally animalistic rituals playing this critical role. You see in agrarian societies the same role being played by rites of passage or feast days. The average 14th century English person spent 1 in 5 days in a feast day. And you see in industrial societies the role being played by clubs and societies, but also, exactly as you say, the school place and by the workplace. The two villains of the piece, because there are two villains, and the good news is I think we've identified them. There are two villains. The bad news is there are things we really like. So one of the villains is change, because once most of us has stopped being nomads, and when we settled in the village, we didn't want to dance the apem anymore. It didn't fit our society. Change disrupts these volumes. We don't do feast days anymore. We don't join clubs. When society changes, nothing wrong with the change. I'm pro-change. But when the change happens, it disrupts. But the other villain of the piece is choice. People still go to school. People still go to the workplace, the place where a lot of city dwellers really did knit together. But we choose where we send our children to school. We choose where we work. And as I said, it's a battle between people like me syndrome. When I choose, I pick people like me, and the common life throwing us together with people not like us. So if we have a lot of choice and a lot of change, we see a decline of the voluntary, very attractive associations because they don't fit the modern society. And we see a decline of the mandatory because we see them as intolerable because we want to choose. So I see those as the two main villains. I think social media doesn't help, but I think politicians and Fox News and etc. doesn't help. But I don't think it's a core cause. I think it's a symptom. In an undivided society, those things don't have much play. I think they have so much play because we're already divided.
And if you do take that very long view, how much does the division of labour between manual and mental work matter? So if you think back to what Durkheim used to talk about, mechanical solidarity, because people are basically the same, but after the division of labour, you actually have to form shared values and create a sort of more organic solidarity. David Goodhart's written more recently a book about the head v heart and the big division in society between people who take those different routes. Do you think that is important? And also just deepening inequality and extremes of wealth?
Yeah, it does matter. So, as I said, the industrial society knitted together clubs and associations, schools, people went to the local school place, and the workplace. Now, the thing about manufacturing, and this is not saying manufacturing is better than services, but the thing about it was that you would have a small number of people who were being paid more, who were managing and more senior, and quite a large number of people who were doing the working. The other thing that was key is people had to be located in roughly the same area of the country. The conversation between management and workers required some face-to-face connection that required people to be proximate. The thing about knowledge work or more services work, if we think about a company like Uber, who needs to be co-located? Well, it's the knowledge workers who need to be co-located, the people doing the design work, the people doing the marketing, the people doing the pricing, the people writing the algorithm. They'll be all probably in the same town or the same city. But the people doing the manual work, well, they can be anywhere. And you see this with Nike, the designers, the thinkers, the managers, they're all in one place, probably in the US. But the people doing the construction and the making, they're somewhere else. And so the knowledge economy creates a natural division reallocation of where people are, which makes it even harder for the workplace to connect us together. But my argument isn't let's turn back the clock to the 1950s because it wasn't great. I mean, that society had really serious problems, especially around gender and around race. But it had evolved a set of institutions that did help to connect people together, particularly across divisions of age, divisions of education, and divisions of wealth. We need to find a new set of institutions, not turn the clock back. We need to find a new set of institutions that can do the job now.
So let's get into, we'll skip past why this matters, because you've got a big section in your book about why this matters to people's health, the quality of our democracy, to our economy. I'm going to take that as a slight given, because I think what's good about your book is that you've got lots of good provocative ideas. I think when you introduced it to me, you said you may well disagree with them, and that's great. It doesn't just stop at diagnosis. But in a sense, the diagnosis that you've got, which is we fundamentally like being with people like us, people like me syndrome is what you call it, that feels really intractable, because presumably even if you do somewhat force people together in the same schools or the same neighborhoods, don't we then just gravitate towards our own even within those bubbles?
Well, two things. One, yes, we do. If you just put place, that's what people like me syndrome does. So if you just say, well, we've got children from different backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, different income levels, and we put them all in a school of 1,000 people, job done. It doesn't work like that. People do self-segregate. And some of that self-segregation on some level, we can overdo the sort of hand-wringing here, isn't awful. Like, I like the West Wing and I like talking about it. A lot of people also like the West Wing and like talking about it. Great, let's hang out together. Other people shouldn't have to suffer us. Like there is a certain amount of self-segregation that is not always awful. But as I say, as you say, there are significant impacts of it at scale. Now, but if you put people in a smaller group where they don't have so much choice, so if you put people in a class or a group of 15, or the reason I was always passionate about doing youth work with groups of 12 is it's quite hard to self-segregate in a group that small. Now, here's the good news. The good news is that people who we see as being like us isn't fixed. It's actually quite malleable. There's a marvelous experiment that was conducted by Mark Levine and Stephen Riker. And what they did is they got a set of volunteers who are all Man United football fans. And they called them forward one at a time. And they stood in front of them and said, can you confirm that you like Manchester United? Yes. Who's your favourite Manchester United player? What's your best Man United game you've ever seen? What is it you like about being a Manchester United fan? Then they asked them to walk over to a building about 300 yards away where they said the experiment will take place. Typical trick, the experiment obviously takes place on the way over to the building. Now, as they're walking over, a researcher from the team comes running past and falls over. Now, the question is, will the volunteer stop to help the researcher? Now, a third of the time, the researcher is wearing a Manchester United top. A third of the time, they're wearing a Liverpool top. And a third of the time, who are Man United sort of arch enemies, a third of the time, they're wearing just a red top, so the same colour, but not a football top. Now, what Levine and Riker found was that the Man United fans were much more likely to help other Man United fans and much less likely to help the others. So people like me syndrome in action. But they reran the experiment. Again, Manchester United fans, one by one, come forward. The questions were different. Can you confirm that you're a football fan? Who's your favourite football player? What's the best football game you've ever seen? What do you like about football? And then again, a third of the people falling over Man United, a third Liverpool, a third just red tops. And what they found was that the volunteers were now just as likely to help the Liverpool fan as they were to help the Man United fan, and they still weren't likely to help the red topped because they shifted what counted as people like me. And the great thing about the human condition, back to laughter, when we're thrown together, especially in the right way, and the right way is quite important, we do form bonds with each other. That's why this species has done so well. We do form bonds. And so the key is we need to play into that natural advantage. We need to connect people together and let them form those bonds.
I love that example, John. As a Liverpool fan, I struggled to believe it at the start, and then it was really good. But what's the implication of that? Because in some ways it suggests that we've got multiple identities. The more we can we can prime people and frame things in a way that brings one identity to the surface and make it more salient. Or we can do the opposite. And I think what you see, Charles Tilley's work actually suggests that what political entrepreneurs do who are seeking to divide and mobilize us then boundaries is bring out one part of your identity against another. But how can we sort of do the opposite and try and almost take the insight from that experiment and apply it more broadly?
Yeah, so the key thing is exactly to build on your excellent point. We have multiple identities. All of us have multiple identities. Every single one of us. I'm English. I'm British. I'm a Christian. I'm white. I'm a father. I'm a son. I love watching football, but I'm terrible at it. Like we all have sort of things that form a sense of belonging, but they naturally section us with different people. Now, the way to play into this, let me use an example. In 1944, on December the 16th at 5:30 in the morning, right at the end of the Second World War, the Allies are advancing into Europe, and it looks like it's all over. And Hitler does what he always tended to do in these situations, which was to throw the dice madly. And he throws forward about 600,000 men to attack, to try and break the supply line. The Allies are stretched, they're stretching into Belgium, and he attacks them in Belgium to try and break the supply line. It's a completely crazy thing to do, but it's so crazy it completely catches the Allies off guard. And it's known now as the Battle of the Bulge, and it's sort of the final battle before the Nazis are defeated. And it looks for a while that Hitler's attack is going to work. And Eisenhower, who's in charge of the Allies forces, is terribly concerned about what's happening. And he's desperately calling up as many men as he can possibly get to the front, until his generals are saying there are no more men to call. And Eisenhower said, there must be. And eventually he's told that there's a battalion of men that have not been called to the front, that are perfectly trained and ready to fight, but haven't been deployed. And Eisenhower said, this is completely ludicrous. Get them out there. They're black Americans. And the US Army is segregated in the same way the southern states are segregated. And they've always been segregated. And Eisenhower on that day decides to break the rules and says, I want those men, if they're prepared to volunteer, to go to the front to fight in white battalions. And he desegregates the US Army. Now, 2 years later, a survey is done of the white men who fought and across the World War II. And the majority of the men have never served with a black serviceman. 70% of them say they want no part in desegregation. But the white men who've served at the front with those black servicemen, 93% of them support desegregation. Now, what's happened is it wasn't great talk. It wasn't some speech that Eisenhower gave. It was the shared intense experience. Now, a war is particularly extreme, but we can take some principles from it. Firstly, there was an equality of status that was created. The men were wearing the same uniforms, doing the same tasks. There wasn't a hierarchy, at least it wasn't on the basis of the white and the black men. They also had an intense shared experience. Something very important about intensity. When you ask what's my identity, often my identity is formed by intense things that I've done. I've run a marathon. I set up a charity. I let something I cared about went bust. These moments define us. And people who are with us in those moments become seen as people like us, but also routine. So doing things, whether it's marching, whether it's eating a meal, whether it's playing a particular game, these things create a bond. And so what we need is moments that can bring people together with an equality of status and either have an intensity to them or some routine to them. And this is what those common life experiences throughout human history have done.
Yeah, and a lot of what you're describing, I think, relates to, what Gordon Allport talked about as the contact hypothesis. That if you actually bring people together with an equal status, with some common goals, then it can be a great way of reducing prejudice. And that was something that was theorized back in the 1950s. More recently, there have been some quite interesting experiments to try and test that out. A couple that I've read about recently. One is attempts to bring together Christians in Iraq with Muslims, Christians who'd been were fleeing ISIS, and bringing them together in football leagues and seeing whether they actually reduce prejudice. And another one I think was actually in India, looking at trying to mix different castes together in cricket leagues and seeing whether this has an effect on prejudice. And the two things I sort of gleaned from that research, one was sometimes it's quite hard. It definitely does have an effect. So I think the thesis is right. The question is, does it always translate to beyond that immediate context? So for instance, you might be playing cricket together, but the next minute when you're out and you're outside that context, do you still sort of exhibit the same kind of prejudice towards others? And I know this is a slightly different question, it's about prejudice rather than perhaps what you're talking about. But the other thing is from these findings, and this is a consistent finding from a review of multiple studies on the contact hypothesis, is that sometimes it's less good at tackling ethnic and racial divides. And that just made me think about, well, the extent to which does bringing people together work when narrowing rather minor gaps, but does it struggle when there are big value differences or big identity differences between people? And do you have to do even more on that front?
Yeah, so I mean, the general sort of systematic review of contact hypothesis work is positive. Is that it it has an impact and it works. Different studies are more or less effective. I mean, it's definitely not the case that every time you bring people together, it always has an impact. But it's the most promising thing we possibly have that has this impact. And what's promising about it is it doesn't. I mean, most of the research, including that brilliant example of the football, tends to focus on levels of trust. To what extent do you trust each other? But what I lay out in the book is the impact is wider than just trust. So it is also a huge impact on social mobility. So, how do most of us, or how does somewhat less, but not much less than 50% of us hear about jobs? Is through word of mouth. Connections matter colossally, firstly to hear about opportunities, but also to affect what we believe we can do. We tend to think what is possible for us is what's possible for people like us. And so there's a sort of wider impact that we should see as well. But you're absolutely right. Look, the more salient a division in a society, the harder it will be to form that equality of status and to make people feel at ease, and the more intense the shared experience will need to be. I think that's entirely right, and we shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't be surprised by that. I think what's important though is we have a slight tendency to think we need one solution for the division around race and religion, and then the wealth division is something completely different. The age, but these are all very similar things. They're all about people like me syndrome and a lack of common life.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions I just want to bring in. So Isabel De Mello sort of asked whether it's possible to achieve the same levels of trust as Scandinavian countries, which are very homogenous. And I think the other question I'd love to turn to is Nick Russo, who's talked about cities as well, where often you tend to think about cities being melting pots and bring people together. They're sometimes better for minorities, whereas in rural areas you might have to mix with others, which is better. So perhaps you can just take a couple of these.
Yeah, I used to work with Isabel, so always lovely to see her, and always she's very thoughtful on these things. So, I mean, the one of the things I touched on in the book is what impact does difference have. So, I think there is a view that says, look, the reason that we're divided is because of ethnic diversity, and that's the whole thing. There we go, done, solved. Now, what I'm trying to say in the book is that massively that's not right, because we have much more difference than just our ethnic diversity. As I say, we have difference by age, different by income, different by values, different so on. But there's a kernel of important truth somewhere in that sort of misguided push, which is if we were all literally identical, like if everyone wore glasses and had ginger hair and liked The West Wing, I mean, it'd be an appalling state. And you imagine the public policy to achieve it, it would be sort of worse than North Korea. But you wouldn't have division because everyone was identical. So on one level, if you have no diversity at all, this problem does vanish. But that's a sort of hiding unto nothing. And so it doesn't really get us very far. But there is something we shouldn't sort of be blind to the point, even if it doesn't lead us very far. But we should expect societies that are more homogenous, and I include in this inequality. So societies that are less divided by income, less extreme, have higher levels of trust because they will have less division. But the policy question to me is, okay, so yes, there is a lever you could pull to try and reduce some difference. That's why I think people have been in favour of reducing immigration. One of the reasons you could, my push is, I think there's a limit policy-wise on how far you can get on either of those levers, even if you wanted to pull them. And you're still going to have a society that has a high level of difference. And so you still have to think about common life activity. Sorry, Ravi.
No, I was going to say, let's bring in Nick's question on cities and rural issues.
Yeah, on cities, absolutely spot on right that you can find people more like you. And so I show in the book, the bigger the group, the bigger the impact of people like me syndrome. Cities are more segregated by wealth and by ethnicity than smaller places are. Same is true for bigger universities. Same is true for bigger schools. It's important we sort of get this into my head. They're better for minorities. It sort of depends. I mean, it's definitely true that if you're the only person in a place who has a particular identity, that's incredibly isolating and can make you very vulnerable and lonely and can affect levels of anxiety. So in that sense, they are better. But what you find in one of the main reasons we live in cities is because the amount of connection creates wealth, because ideas spread around, it raises productivity, everyone benefits. But segregation really reduces that effect because the ideas don't spread. And who are the people who lose out the most? It's the minority groups, because they're left in the smaller groups. So to some extent, actually, the need to try and get this connection working is most important for those of us who might find ourselves in the smaller groups.
Great. Now, John, let's get onto some of the solutions you've got in the book. And I guess the sort of umbrella is you're trying to create new institutions that bring people together, that create this shared experiences, particularly intense experiences. So perhaps you just outline your argument.
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing to say, and this is why the long sweep history is so important, we do need to see how anomalous the present situation is. We spent 98% of our existence as hunter-gatherers with very clear rituals that connected us together. We spent then a huge chunk of time of what is left as agrarian farmers. And rites of passage, feast days played a significant role in connecting us. And a lot of the time as city dwellers, we've relied on these other institutions, clubs and society, schools to connect us. So the first thing to say is we're in an odd position where we are losing those connected positions. So I think there's three things we can do at the big policy level. One is with regard to sorting out the lack of a common life. One is to do absolutely nothing about it. And to just say, well, really, it's not the business of government to worry about the lack of an intermediate institution, a common life that connects people who don't want to be together. It's not a place for public policy. Leave it alone. That is the default position of pretty much every Western society at present. It's not an invalid position. But previously, when we've lost a common life, so when we moved to become agrarians, it took 1,000 years for the new common life to turn up. When we moved to cities, it took 100 years for the new common life to turn up. So we shouldn't expect this to happen fast. And we should just expect that we're going to be pretty divided for quite a long period of time, and we should stop whining about it. Totally valid option, but that we should accept the consequences with the option. The second option is to slow down the pace of change. So this is the approach, as I say, the Nordic countries have taken. As a result of doing so, I don't think this was their plan, but the result of doing so, they are first, second, as I say, third, and fifth for levels of trust, responsibility, connection, and they have clubs and societies that have managed to adapt to a slower rate of change, and people still attend them quite well. I just don't think it's a credible option. I mean, the amount of change that's coming our way through technological change is likely to be very high. And so it doesn't seem to me that this is the way to go, even though I think you could probably build a political movement around it if you were so minded. So what's the remaining option? Well, the remaining option is to look at the country that's fourth in that list of five. And that country is Singapore. And the Singaporean approach has been to be very open to change. Very high rates of immigration. 40% of Singaporeans weren't born in the country. Very open to economic transitions and change. But what they've done is they've reduced the levels of choice about how people spend their time, which immediately sounds horrendous to us Westerners. What have they done? They've thought about the way schooling works so that people will mix more. They use national service as a way to mix people more. They even allocate housing in order that people will mix more. Now, I don't think you can copy and paste Singapore, but I think we have a tendency to think we can learn nothing from these Southeast Asian islands. I mean, we looked at Taiwan's lockdown and we're like, well, we could never do that, which I think most of us now think was a terribly foolish way to think about what we should be learning. Now, I think there is a Western version of what Singapore has done. What might it look like? It might say, well, children have to spend 100 months at school by law. Why can't they spend one of those 100 months doing community activity with children from all different schools, including private schools? It might say that one of the main things many of us will do, not all of us, but many of us will do in our lives, is start a family. Why don't we say, let's make a generous offer on childcare, but as a requirement to go alongside it, parents have to go along to 5 or 6 sessions to learn about how their children's brains develop and how they learn, and do it with parents from across town, people they didn't choose. Finally, nearly all of us will retire at some point. We'll have hopefully 20 years to 30 years left of our life. It's a time that we could do so much. Why don't we continue to be generous with pensions, but say to people, look, you need to come along to a number of sessions locally to see how you might get involved in your local community with other people who you don't know who are also retiring. 3 new institutions to try and knit our societies together. Now, I don't think that sounds appalling. Now, I think what people might say is, yeah, but that's just completely inconceivable, John, that the West would ever mandate people to do things with each other. And my challenge, final thought, my challenge would be 2 things. Firstly, fine, it may be inconceivable, but what's the alternative? We seem to, most of us say there is a problem with division, and it does matter. So let's have some more warm words about British values and some garden parties or street parties for the Queen's birthday, which feels like bringing warm words to a gunfight. And finally, actually, nearly every serious political change that's ever happened in this country, from the NHS to the welfare state, from joining the EU to leaving it, all of them started off as inconceivable until they became imaginable, until they became likely, until they became unavoidable. I mean, the aim of the book really, Ravi, is to say that I want to start the journey for this idea from being inconceivable, from being slowly decades to being unavoidable.
Yeah, Astra Teller, who's the head of Google X, which tries to design moonshots, has a test for any kind of moonshot idea, which is it has to feel laughable at first. Because if it's not laughable, it's probably not a moonshot. It's not, I think, not that your ideas are laughable, John. I'm not.
Ex-stand-up comedian.
Exactly. But I think what's interesting about some of your ideas, if you take the parenting one, that might be a very, very good thing to do just in terms of improving parenting and early childhood development. And there might be a very nice spin-off benefit if you design it in a way that is actually promoting intergroup mixing as opposed to just cementing existing bonds. So I think you can make the justification on more than one ground. On the question of your idea of 1 month in 100 that's a secondary school that a child spends at school, 1 month would be doing something together with others outside of their natural school community. I think my question on that would be one of dosage. Is 1 in 100 months in your whole life going to make a big difference to who you end up being friends with, who you end up hanging around with?
Well, the truth is we don't know this as a sort of binary thing. It's not like I can say, we've spent the amount of money on this already, equivalent to AstraZeneca and Pfizer on the vaccines, and we know that this is the dose that will work. I mean, we're still not quite clear on the vaccines exactly. We're learning what the right dosage is to get to the right effect. So it shouldn't really surprise us that we don't yet know. Is it 4 weeks? Is it 6 weeks? But
I think the general point is that I can imagine like the dosage that is politically acceptable and acceptable to people might never be enough to actually fundamentally change our bias towards just hanging out with people like us.
But I don't think we do. I don't think we need to fundamentally change it.
Okay.
We don't need to make people think everyone's exactly the same as me and I just want to hang out with as many people who are unlike me as possible. That's not human. I mean, that's never going to happen. But
so what's the ambitious but realistic goal then for you?
The realistic goal is that people don't think that other people are potentially evil and a threat. That actually they're trustworthy and they have more, to quote, they have more in common. We have more in common than that which divides us. Not that we're all the same, not that we don't want to hang out in some groups like us. I mean, take age difference. People in their teens don't want to hang out with someone who's 60 as much as someone in their teens. They shouldn't. It's not normal. It's fine. But they shouldn't be scared of people who are older. They should be able to enter the workplace and feel at ease talking to people who are older. I don't think that's at all an unrealistic goal. I think our society's been like that actually most of our lives, most of humanity's history. It's really in the last 100 years that this has become so odd. I think that's a sort of very realistic goal.
And there's a question from Nathan Singleton, which is about, is it easier for young people to integrate with people not like them rather than older people? And I'd almost ask you, what's more important? Should we be trying to heal intergenerational division, or should we be trying to tackle class division?
Yeah, I know Nathan's worked very well. It does actually wonderful work with particularly young people. I mean, I sometimes have been told, I've been working in this field for about a decade, and I've often been told that, look, young people is the place to hit this. I haven't seen any evidence of that. that actually people are particularly susceptible. There are definitely moments, though, in people's lives where I think we can credibly say people are more susceptible to changing their identity a little bit and accepting others. And I think it's at moments of transition. So there's something around the moment of becoming a grown-up. So that puberty moment, I think there's something there. There's something about leaving home. There's something about settling and having a family. There's something about starting a new job. There's something about retiring. And people will think of other moments of transition. But these transition moments are great because our identity anyway is a little bit in flux. And we are tending to look for new people to connect with. So that would be my push. And you'll see my 3 ideas all fit with that principle.
Great. I want to throw you a couple of other ideas at you that fit in with your thesis, hopefully. One actually is touched on by one of the questions in the chat by Naeem about what do you see for the role of digital in building new ways of bonding to replace what has gone. And actually, Salma Musa's work I referenced before around ISIS and Football League. She's done some work on sort of virtual cooperation, exploiting a natural experiment in American schools, which suggests that, again, virtual cooperation could be quite positive in this regard. And it just feels so much easier to do and almost do it on a drip feed regular basis. How do you think that could help contribute?
So I think the jury is really out on digital. So look, there are little experiments that show that this could. There's no reason in theory why it couldn't work. What do we know works? Equality of status, bringing people together who seem different, something intense or something routine. There's no reason in theory that couldn't happen digitally. I just don't think there's enough evidence to back it yet. And it does have clear disadvantages. There is generally a lower intensity of experience in digital interaction. So I think there are reasons to be a little bit doubtful. And digital generally, if we think about social media, as I say, I don't think social media is the cause of our divisions, but it clearly hasn't helped because the easier it is to choose who to connect with, social media is so easy, the more we should expect people like me syndrome to play in.
Yeah, maybe it's about hybrid. If you did have your 1 month school service that you talked about, there's no reason why you couldn't have top-ups at a later stage that are bringing those groups together virtually that maybe cements that.
That's right, and ideally it would be from the people themselves. Friendships sustain. The most sustainable thing a charity can do is build a friendship. I mean,
that's what the other question in my mind when I was reading this was that some of it sounds very worthy. National service, compulsorily meeting older people, etc. But there are other ways of creating the kind of intense experiences you talked about. So this is on the laughable end of the spectrum, John. But if I think about intense ways of bringing diverse groups of people together, potentially, dancing, MDMA, major drug experiences. Those are things that, build deep empathy, build a connection, break down barriers. So, what about recommending that?
Well, I mean, as the executive director of a charity focused on reducing violence amongst young people, I probably shouldn't get into drugs policy. But I think, look, broadly, there is a danger, I think, that people who write books like mine, and I hope, for those who haven't read it, do read it, but I think you'll find I have broadly avoided this, who think that the only way to connect people is to get people discussing politics and doing do-goodery. I just don't believe that at all. How many of my friendships, and I like politics, how many of my friendships are actually based on politics discussions? Almost none of them. Like, they're based on doing something that I really love together. And I hate dancing. But look, dancing is proven to be a very effective way of forming connection, because it's got intensity and routine to it. So no reason at all. I just can't imagine. Look, I think the government does need to mandate. And I just couldn't face recommending that we mandate everyone to dance. I think I might end my own existence. But there should be space, right? I mean, look, when I'm talking about people as they retire coming together, I'm not suggesting they come together and sort of talk about how their society should transform. I'm saying they should come together and say, okay, what do you want to do with your life? What are you passionate about? Here's some opportunities to get involved. And one of those things might well be, if you're great at ballroom dancing, run a session. Teach teenagers how to do it. I mean, it should be something you're passionate about. Yeah,
I think it's important to try and think about how you go with the grain of what people want to do already. So, if hundreds of thousands of people do take drugs, do kind of go clubbing, whatever, that's something to build on and think about how you can actually bring people together rather than sort of sometimes construct these quite artificial things. That's what I was trying to get at. Just one thing on the question of mandatory versus voluntary. because you sort of frame this as mandatory, these three ideas around service. But would you say that they are sort of prompted or incentivized as opposed to the full forcible? How mandatory are we talking about?
Yeah, so look, the first thing is that I started off with a presumption was things that go with, to your phrase, go with the grain. People would love to do that can be voluntary and get as many people involved as possible. I spent a decade of my life building what became the fastest growing youth movement since 1912. I feel like I've had a good go at this. We've reached 1 in 6 young people in the country to do the National Citizen Service, entirely voluntary and designed entirely with hundreds of young people on the basis of what do they love doing. There's nothing in that program that was new. It was all based on stuff that had been tried and tested through young people enjoying stuff. They enjoy, spending time with each other, putting on events, singing, dancing, putting on shows, making videos. I mean, it's entirely, I almost, could go back in time and say, I've followed your advice. I just don't think 1 in 6 is good enough. I think we have to do better than that. And I bow to the person who can do better than I did. But I just don't, I think 1 in 6 is really good. So I start with the voluntary. Now, to what extent you absolutely compulse by the force of law versus incentivize, I think I take the same approach to jury service. There needs to be a reasonableness to this. There's a reason I can't do it at the moment. There's something else going on that's important. Of course, no problem at all. But I do think we expect people to do jury service. And we don't expect them to go to prison if they don't, but we probably expect some sort of fine or something eventually to happen if you keep turning it down. Not because we love forcing people to do stuff, but our free society relies on jury service. In the same way that I think people need to pay taxes, not because I love taking money off people, but because our free society relies on some tax money. And I think most people probably have some sympathy for this. Our free society relies on us not all falling into tribes where we don't trust each other. And so in the same way, if I'm prepared to accept the mandatory taking of money out of my pocket to pay for things I morally disapprove of, right? The government can do things with that money that I might think is completely unethical, but I accept it. Then I think we can accept the idea that we might be required to 3 times in our life spend some time with people we don't know.
And in terms of how we get on that journey, because I had a go about 15 years ago at trying to bring in some compulsory parenting programs, failed. But what I possibly think now is that you might start with auto-enrollment and see how far that gets you. You might build a strong social norm around that, and then might see whether do you need to go to the full jury service model, or even if you do, maybe you've got such a sort of critical mass that it becomes socially acceptable to do so. I
completely agree with you. That would be the way to do it. You start off by saying here's an optional benefit that you can have if you do this. I wouldn't call it parenting classes. You see how I positioned it. You can learn about the way your child develops and their brain works. I think most people will see that. You don't want to patronize people. But yeah, I think you'd start with getting the mass. I mean, the tests I say is we mustn't mandate anything unless it can pass 3 tests. The majority of the public want the thing to be mandatory. The majority of people who will take part want the thing to be mandatory. The majority of people who have taken part still want the thing to be mandatory. It's got to be able to pass those 3 tests. And I think starting off with, you can get this great benefit, we'll probably get, a large number of people to start with, they'll experience it and say, it was great. That was really good. Everyone should do this.
John, it's been really, really great having you on. It's a fascinating book on an issue I think that is right at the top of people's concerns, and it's well worth a read. It's full of great stories. Before we end, can I just ask you, your book actually ends with an epilogue with about 30 odd things that individuals can do. I won't get you list 32 in the 60 seconds we've got left, but give us 3.
Well, let me definitely do one. So everyone could just go off as soon as this ends. They could get up their social media feed and they could look at the last 10 people who messaged and ask themselves, do I agree with these 10 people on key things that matter to me? And if the answer is yes for all 10 of them, find someone you disagree with and follow them. Just to diversify your feed. If I was to add a second, I'd say practice hospitality. Neighbours round once a year. Doesn't have to be that many, could be just 4, but just pick them randomly. Don't just pick the people who you think will like you and invite them round for a drink, a nibble, a chat, something. Those would be 2 things people could do pretty easily and pretty quickly.
John Yates, thank you very, very much for coming on Nesta Talks 2. And thank you, everybody, for joining and contributing questions. Have a very good rest of the day. Thank you very much.